The claim that Bernard Montgomery nearly ruined D-Day is not based on a single catastrophic mistake, but on a series of strategic decisions, personality-driven conflicts, and operational assumptions that created unnecessary risk at the most critical moment of the Second World War. To understand why Dwight D. Eisenhower allowed this to happen, one must examine the structure of Allied command, the political realities of coalition warfare, and Montgomery's unique position within the British military establishment in 1944. By the time planning for Operation Overlord reached its final phase, Montgomery had become the most prominent British field commander of the war. His victory at El Alamein in late 1942 had elevated him to near-mythical status in Britain, where morale had been battered by years of defeats and retreats. For the British public and political leadership alike, Montgomery symbolized resilience, discipline, and eventual victory. This reputation followed him into the planning of the Normandy invasion and granted him influence that exceeded his formal authority. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, faced a dilemma that was political as much as military. The success of Overlord depended on Anglo-American unity, not only in resources but in public perception. Removing or openly overruling Montgomery risked alienating the British government and undermining confidence in the Allied command structure. As a result, Eisenhower often chose compromise where firmness might have reduced risk. Montgomery was appointed commander of all Allied ground forces for the invasion phase, a role that placed him directly above senior American generals such as Omar Bradley. In theory, this arrangement was temporary, designed to ensure unified control during the fragile beachhead phase. In practice, it allowed Montgomery to reshape the invasion plan in ways that reflected his own conservative operational philosophy. One of Montgomery's first actions was to expand the original invasion frontage. The initial Overlord plan envisioned landings on 3 beaches. Montgomery insisted on expanding this to 5: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, arguing that a broader front would reduce the risk of being pushed back into the sea. While this change had merit, it dramatically increased logistical complexity and placed enormous strain on landing craft availability, naval gunfire coordination, and airborne operations. More critically, Montgomery's confidence in his own assessment of German reactions led him to underestimate the operational chaos that would inevitably accompany the landings. He believed that once ashore, Allied forces could quickly stabilize the front and advance inland according to a relatively orderly timetable. This assumption ignored the reality that German resistance, terrain, weather, and command friction would disrupt even the best-laid plans. Montgomery's approach to risk was paradoxical. He was personally cautious to the point of rigidity, yet his insistence on total control introduced systemic vulnerabilities. He centralized decision-making at a time when flexibility and rapid adaptation were essential. Subordinate commanders often found themselves constrained by directives that did not reflect conditions on the ground, particularly in the British and Canadian sectors east of the Orne River. The British objective of capturing Caen on D-Day exemplified this problem. Montgomery viewed Caen as a linchpin whose capture would unhinge German defenses in Normandy. He assumed that British forces could seize the city within the first 24 hours. This assumption proved disastrously optimistic. German armored units, including elements of elite panzer divisions, responded far faster and more effectively than anticipated. Caen became the scene of weeks of brutal fighting rather than a swift breakthrough. While the failure to take Caen on D-Day did not doom the invasion, it undermined the coherence of Montgomery's broader strategy. His public statements before and after the landings suggested that events were unfolding according to plan, even as the situation deteriorated into a grinding battle of attrition. This disconnect between rhetoric and reality strained relations with American commanders, who bore the brunt of German counterattacks in the West. Eisenhower was fully aware of these tensions. Reports from Bradley and other American officers made clear that Montgomery's projections had been overly optimistic, and that his control over ground operations was becoming counterproductive. Yet Eisenhower refrained from decisive intervention. The reasons were not rooted in ignorance or indecision, but in the fragile balance of Allied politics. British participation in Overlord was not merely symbolic. Britain provided critical naval forces, air bases, intelligence infrastructure, and logistical support without which the invasion could not succeed. Montgomery's removal or public humiliation risked destabilizing that contribution at a moment when unity was paramount. Eisenhower chose to absorb operational inefficiencies rather than provoke a political crisis. At the same time, Montgomery's behavior after the landings began to generate long-term consequences. By framing the British role as deliberately fixing German forces in the east, while Americans broke out in the west, he retroactively redefined his earlier failures as intentional strategy. This narrative, while partially valid, masked the extent to which initial objectives had not been met and shifted blame away from flawed planning assumptions. The danger, therefore, was not that Montgomery alone could ruin D-Day, but that his authority, combined with Eisenhower's political restraint, allowed avoidable risks to persist during the most vulnerable phase of the invasion. The Allies succeeded not because these risks did not exist, but because German command failures, Allied material superiority, and extraordinary effort at the tactical level compensated for strategic misjudgments at the top. The relationship between Eisenhower and Montgomery before D-Day was marked by mutual dependence rather than mutual trust. Eisenhower admired Montgomery's ability to inspire British troops and recognized his importance as a national symbol, but he was also aware of Montgomery's inflexibility, self-promotion, and tendency to oversimplify complex operations. Montgomery, for his part, viewed Eisenhower as politically skilled but militarily inexperienced at the level of large-scale ground command, a perception that influenced how he interacted with the Supreme Allied Commander. In the months leading up to June 1944, Montgomery effectively positioned himself as the indispensable architect of the ground campaign. He cultivated direct relationships with British political leaders and senior officers, reinforcing the notion that his presence was essential for success. This leverage limited Eisenhower's freedom of action. Any attempt to marginalize Montgomery risked being interpreted as an American effort to dominate the coalition, a narrative that London was highly sensitive to after years of bearing the brunt of the war. Montgomery's revisions to the Overlord plan were presented as improvements rather than departures. By expanding the invasion front and increasing the number of divisions committed on D-Day, he argued that he was reducing the chance of failure. Eisenhower accepted this logic, but the trade-offs were significant. The broader front diluted the concentration of force at critical points, particularly at Omaha Beach, where American troops faced some of the strongest German defenses. The assumption was that airborne operations and naval gunfire would compensate for this dispersion, an assumption that proved only partially correct. The airborne component of the invasion illustrates another area where Montgomery's confidence contributed to risk. Airborne landings were intended to secure key terrain and disrupt German reinforcements, but they were heavily dependent on precise timing and coordination. Weather conditions on the night of 5 to 6 June scattered airborne units across Normandy, reducing their effectiveness in the opening hours. Montgomery had accepted these risks as manageable, but the margin for error was thinner than he acknowledged. Montgomery's command style further complicated matters. He preferred detailed, prescriptive plans and expected subordinates to adhere closely to them. This approach worked best in set-piece battles with clear objectives and overwhelming force, conditions that did not exist on the beaches of Normandy. As reports of confusion and resistance reached headquarters on D-Day, Montgomery was slow to adjust his expectations. His belief that events were proceeding broadly as intended delayed the recognition that some sectors were in serious danger. The British and Canadian landings, particularly on Sword and Juno beaches, encountered stiff resistance and rapid German countermoves. The failure to secure Caen on the first day had cascading effects. German armored units were able to establish defensive positions that forced the British into prolonged, costly battles. Montgomery later framed this outcome as a deliberate effort to draw German strength eastward, but contemporary records indicate that the initial plan did not anticipate such a protracted struggle. Eisenhower faced a critical choice in the days immediately following the landings. He could assert direct control over ground operations, effectively sidelining Montgomery, or he could maintain the existing command structure and hope that the situation stabilized. He chose the latter. This decision was influenced by more than deference to Montgomery's status. Eisenhower understood that frequent changes at the top during an ongoing operation could create confusion and erode confidence among subordinate commanders. American frustration grew rapidly. Bradley and other U.S. officers questioned Montgomery's optimism and resented his public statements, which often emphasized British control of the battle narrative. These tensions threatened to undermine cooperation at a time when seamless coordination was essential. Eisenhower intervened selectively, pressing Montgomery privately to accelerate operations while avoiding public confrontation. The near failure at Omaha Beach underscored how close the invasion came to disaster. Had German reserves been committed more decisively in the first 24 hours, or had weather conditions further delayed reinforcements, the fragile beachhead might have collapsed. Montgomery's plan assumed that German command paralysis would persist long enough for Allied superiority to assert itself. This assumption proved correct, but it was not guaranteed, and its success owed as much to German hesitation as to Allied design. Montgomery's post-D-Day conduct further strained Allied relations. His insistence on portraying the campaign as unfolding exactly as planned was not merely a matter of ego, it was a defensive maneuver. Admitting miscalculation would have weakened his authority and invited greater oversight from Eisenhower and the Americans. By controlling the narrative, Montgomery preserved his position, but at the cost of trust. Eisenhower tolerated this behavior because he prioritized the larger objective. His leadership style favored consensus and continuity over confrontation. While this approach helped sustain the coalition, it also allowed structural problems to persist longer than necessary. The question of whether a more forceful intervention would have reduced casualties or shortened the campaign remains debated, but there is little doubt that Montgomery's autonomy shaped the course of the battle in ways that were not always advantageous. By late June 1944, it had become clear that the Normandy campaign would not follow the timetable Montgomery had envisioned. The Allies were secure on the continent, but they were locked into a slow, attritional struggle. The immediate danger had passed, but the consequences of early decisions continued to influence operations. The opportunity for rapid exploitation had been lost, and the campaign's character was set. As the Normandy campaign settled into a grinding struggle, Montgomery began a subtle but consequential reinterpretation of events. What had initially been framed as a rapid advance toward Caen was gradually recast as a deliberate strategy of attrition. According to this revised narrative, British and Canadian forces were intentionally fixing German armor in the east, creating the conditions for an American breakout in the west. While this interpretation contained elements of truth, it obscured the fact that the original objectives had been more ambitious and had not been achieved. This reframing served several purposes. It protected Montgomery's reputation, justified the slow pace of British operations, and shifted the burden of decisive maneuver onto American forces. It also aligned conveniently with Eisenhower's broader strategy once the opportunity for a rapid breakout had passed. By late June and early July 1944, the Allies no longer had the luxury of debating initial intentions. They had to adapt to the reality on the ground. However, the cost of this narrative adjustment was significant. American commanders perceived it as an attempt to claim strategic foresight after the fact, rather than an honest acknowledgement of miscalculation. This perception deepened existing mistrust. Bradley, in particular, believed that Montgomery's fixation on Caen consumed disproportionate resources while yielding limited operational benefit. The British front absorbed enormous German strength, but at the price of heavy casualties and a stalled advance. Eisenhower found himself increasingly mediating between competing interpretations of the campaign. His public statements emphasized unity and collective purpose, while his private correspondence revealed growing impatience. He recognized that Montgomery's command style, effective in limited contexts, was ill-suited to the fluid, multinational environment of Northwest Europe. Yet outright removal remained politically untenable. Instead, Eisenhower pursued a gradual rebalancing of authority. As the beachhead expanded and the immediate danger of being pushed into the sea receded, he prepared to transition ground command to a more decentralized structure. This shift reduced Montgomery's direct control without openly challenging his status. The process was deliberately slow, designed to avoid confrontation while restoring operational flexibility. The consequences of Montgomery's early decisions became most apparent during Operations Epsom, Charnwood, and Goodwood. These offensives, intended to break through German defenses around Caen, resulted in heavy losses and limited territorial gains. Montgomery portrayed them as necessary steps in wearing down German armor, but critics argued that they reflected an inability to adapt tactics to changing conditions. The reliance on massive artillery and air support masked weaknesses in maneuver and coordination. American forces, meanwhile, prepared for Operation Cobra. The contrast between the two approaches was stark. While British operations emphasized containment and attrition, Cobra aimed at rupture and exploitation. Eisenhower supported this divergence, seeing it as a pragmatic response to the strategic situation, rather than an indictment of Montgomery's performance. Nevertheless, it underscored the growing divergence in operational philosophy within the Allied command. Montgomery's influence over the overall campaign did not end with Normandy, but its character changed. He remained a senior commander, but his ability to shape grand strategy diminished. Eisenhower increasingly relied on American commanders for decisive operations, particularly as U.S. numerical superiority became overwhelming. This shift was not announced. It emerged organically as a result of battlefield realities and political calculation. The question of whether Montgomery nearly ruined D-Day thus becomes one of perspective. The invasion succeeded, the beachhead held, and the Allies advanced. Yet success should not obscure the extent of risk incurred. The margin for error on D-Day was narrow, and Montgomery's confidence in his own assumptions contributed to that narrowness. That these assumptions did not result in disaster owes as much to German indecision and Allied resilience as to sound planning. Eisenhower's decision to let him was not an endorsement of Montgomery's infallibility, but an acceptance of constraint. Coalition warfare imposed limits on command authority that no organizational chart could eliminate. Eisenhower chose stability over disruption, believing that unity was the ultimate force multiplier. In doing so, he accepted inefficiencies and contradictions that might have been intolerable in a single-nation army. By mid-July 1944, the narrative of D-Day had already begun to harden into myth. Public accounts emphasized inevitability and coherence, minimizing confusion and disagreement. Montgomery's version of events became part of that myth, particularly in Britain. The complexities of Allied decision-making, the compromises, and the near misses were largely absent from official histories. For historians, the task is not to assign blame simplistically, but to understand how personalities, politics, and structure interact under extreme pressure. Montgomery did not sabotage D-Day, but his approach amplified risk. Eisenhower did not fail to lead, but he chose restraint over confrontation. The outcome was victory, but a victory achieved in spite of, not because of, perfect harmony at the top. Any evaluation of how close D-Day came to failure must take into account the role of German decision-making, because it was German hesitation that ultimately compensated for Allied misjudgments. Montgomery's plan relied heavily, whether consciously or not, on the assumption that German command would react slowly and incoherently. This assumption proved correct, but only narrowly so, and for reasons that lay largely outside Allied control. The German command structure in France in 1944 was deeply flawed. Authority was divided between field commanders, the OKW, and Adolf Hitler himself. German panzer divisions, which posed the greatest threat to the invasion, could not be committed without Hitler's personal approval. On D-Day, confusion over the location of the main landing, reinforced by Allied deception operations, delayed decisive German action. This paralysis created the window of opportunity the Allies needed to survive the most vulnerable phase of the invasion. Had German armored reserves been released more rapidly on 6th of June, the Allied position, especially on the eastern flank near Caen, might have been critically endangered. British and Canadian forces were stretched thin, airborne units were scattered, and the failure to seize key objectives left gaps that could have been exploited. Montgomery's confidence that German forces would be contained proved accurate, but only because German command dysfunction aligned with Allied expectations by chance rather than certainty. The first 48 hours after the landings were therefore decisive. During this period, Allied forces were most exposed to counterattack, and Montgomery's centralized control limited the ability of subordinate commanders to respond dynamically. Requests for adjustments often moved slowly up the chain of command, delaying responses to rapidly changing conditions. This rigidity increased the risk that local setbacks could cascade into broader failure. Eisenhower monitored these developments closely. His headquarters received a steady stream of reports highlighting both progress and danger. He understood that the situation was more precarious than public statements suggested. Yet he also recognized that intervening too forcefully at this stage could create confusion at precisely the wrong moment. The invasion required momentum, not internal conflict at the top. As the immediate crisis passed and German counterattacks failed to materialize at scale, Montgomery's position appeared vindicated. The beachhead held, reinforcements flowed in, and Allied air superiority made large-scale German maneuver increasingly difficult. This outcome reinforced Montgomery's belief in the soundness of his approach and strengthened his post hoc reinterpretation of events as deliberate strategy. Post-war assessments, however, reveal how contested these interpretations were. British accounts tended to emphasize Montgomery's role as stabilizer and architect of victory, while American accounts highlighted missed opportunities and excessive caution. These differences were not merely matters of national pride. They reflected fundamentally different views of what constituted acceptable risk in warfare. Montgomery believed that battles should be won through overwhelming preparation and minimal uncertainty. He valued certainty over speed and control over improvisation. In North Africa, this philosophy had worked well. In Normandy, it collided with the realities of coalition warfare, complex terrain, and a determined enemy. The result was a campaign that succeeded, but at a slower and higher cost than many American commanders believed necessary. Eisenhower's leadership style has often been criticized for excessive accommodation, yet this criticism overlooks the unique demands of his position. He was not merely commanding armies. He was managing a coalition of sovereign nations with divergent interests and historical sensitivities. His authority derived as much from trust as from rank. By choosing not to confront Montgomery directly, he preserved that trust, even as he accepted operational compromises. The long-term implications of this choice extended beyond Normandy. The patterns established there, cautious British advances, aggressive American exploitation, and Eisenhower's role as mediator, shaped the remainder of the campaign in Northwest Europe. They influenced decisions about priorities, resource allocation, and ultimately the race across France and into Germany. The narrative that Montgomery nearly ruined D-Day is therefore best understood as a critique of systemic risk rather than individual failure. The invasion's success depended on a series of fragile alignments: German hesitation, Allied air dominance, and extraordinary resilience at the tactical level. Montgomery's planning did not cause failure, but it left little room for error. Eisenhower's tolerance of this risk was a calculated gamble driven by political necessity rather than strategic blindness. By the time historians gained access to wartime records, it became clear how close the balance had been. The image of D-Day as an inevitable triumph obscures the reality that it was a near-run thing, shaped by imperfect decisions made under extreme pressure. Montgomery and Eisenhower each played their part, constrained by their personalities, their assumptions, and the structures within which they operated. The experience of Normandy fundamentally altered Eisenhower's approach to managing Montgomery, even if it did not immediately change Montgomery's formal position. Eisenhower emerged from the initial phase of the campaign with a clearer understanding of the limits of Montgomery's utility at the operational level. While he continued to value Montgomery's ability to command British forces and maintain domestic confidence in Britain, he became increasingly cautious about allowing him to shape Allied strategy as a whole. This shift was subtle rather than dramatic. Eisenhower did not issue public rebukes or remove Montgomery from command, but he began to redistribute influence within the Allied command structure. As American forces expanded rapidly in France, numerical superiority translated into greater operational leverage. Eisenhower increasingly relied on American commanders to drive decisive action, while Montgomery's role became more geographically and functionally constrained. The lessons of Normandy informed Eisenhower's handling of later operations. He became more skeptical of overly rigid plans and more attentive to the need for adaptability. Montgomery's insistence on set-piece battles and extensive preparation clashed with Eisenhower's growing preference for exploiting opportunity and maintaining momentum. This divergence would become more pronounced as the Allies broke out of Normandy and advanced rapidly across France. At the same time, Montgomery remained convinced that his interpretation of Normandy was correct. He continued to argue that his role had been to absorb German strength and protect the Allied flank, enabling the American breakout. This belief shaped his proposals for subsequent operations, including his advocacy for a narrow thrust into Germany under his own command. From Montgomery's perspective, Normandy validated his strategic instincts. From Eisenhower's perspective, it highlighted the dangers of granting too much autonomy to a commander whose confidence exceeded his adaptability. The tension between these views came to the fore as the Allies approached the German frontier. Eisenhower favored a broad front strategy that leveraged Allied superiority and reduced the risk of catastrophic reversal. Montgomery, by contrast, pressed for concentrated effort under his leadership, arguing that a single decisive thrust would end the war more quickly. The roots of this disagreement lay in the unresolved questions of Normandy: speed versus certainty, risk versus control. Normandy also left a legacy of mistrust between British and American commanders. While cooperation remained functional, it was no longer based on shared assumptions. American officers viewed Montgomery's caution as obstructionist, while British officers saw American aggressiveness as reckless. Eisenhower's role as mediator became more demanding as operational tempo increased and strategic stakes rose. From a historical perspective, it is important to recognize that Montgomery's actions during D-Day and the subsequent campaign were not irrational or incompetent. They were consistent with his experience, his personality, and his understanding of warfare. The problem was not that Montgomery lacked skill, but that his approach was ill-suited to the specific demands of coalition warfare on the Western Front in 1944. Eisenhower's inability or unwillingness to remove Montgomery must therefore be understood in this context. Eisenhower was constrained not only by politics, but by the absence of a clear alternative that would not disrupt Allied unity. Removing Montgomery would not have eliminated risk. It would have replaced one set of uncertainties with another. Eisenhower chose continuity, even as he quietly adjusted the balance of power. By the autumn of 1944, Montgomery's influence over Allied grand strategy had diminished significantly. Decisions about priorities increasingly reflected Eisenhower's preferences and American capabilities. Montgomery remained a prominent figure, but no longer the central architect of the campaign. The experience of Normandy had clarified his limits in Eisenhower's mind. The enduring controversy over Montgomery's role in D-Day reflects broader questions about leadership under constraint. Success in war is rarely the product of flawless decisions. It emerges from the interaction of imperfect plans, flawed individuals, and unpredictable events. Montgomery's planning did not doom the invasion, but it narrowed the margin for success. Eisenhower's restraint did not guarantee victory, but it preserved the coalition that made victory possible. As more records became available after the war, historians gained a clearer picture of how close the invasion had come to serious difficulty. These records complicate simplistic narratives of heroism or failure. They reveal a command environment marked by tension, compromise, and constant risk management. In this environment, Montgomery and Eisenhower acted not as caricatures, but as leaders shaped by circumstance. The final assessment of whether Montgomery nearly ruined D-Day depends on how one defines responsibility. If responsibility is measured by intent, then Montgomery sought success and believed in his plan. If it is measured by consequence, then his decisions contributed to unnecessary risk at a critical moment. Eisenhower's role was not to eliminate risk entirely, but to manage it within political and strategic constraints. In the final analysis, the assertion that Montgomery nearly ruined D-Day is not an accusation of sabotage or incompetence, but a recognition of how narrow the margin for success truly was. The Normandy invasion succeeded, but it did so under conditions of extraordinary risk, many of which were amplified by decisions taken at the highest levels of command. Montgomery's role in shaping those decisions was substantial, and Eisenhower's choice to tolerate their consequences was deliberate. Montgomery approached the invasion with supreme confidence in his own judgment. He believed that careful planning, numerical superiority, and moral certainty would compensate for uncertainty. This belief had been validated in previous campaigns, particularly in North Africa, where clear lines, predictable enemy behavior, and controlled conditions favored his method. Normandy presented a different environment entirely: fragmented terrain, a capable and adaptive enemy, and the complexity of multinational coordination. In this context, Montgomery's rigidity became a liability rather than a strength. The most significant danger lay not in any single error, but in the cumulative effect of assumptions. The expectation that Caen could be taken quickly, that German reactions would be slow, and that airborne and naval forces would function as planned left little room for deviation. When reality diverged from expectation, the system struggled to adapt rapidly. That it ultimately held together was a testament to Allied resilience, not to flawless design. Eisenhower's decision to allow Montgomery this latitude was rooted in necessity rather than approval. As Supreme Allied Commander, Eisenhower's authority was real but not absolute. He commanded not a single army, but a coalition shaped by national pride, political pressure, and public perception. Montgomery was more than a general. He was a symbol of British resolve,